Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd just like to introduce Stacey van Groll to you. Stacey's with the University of Queensland, and she has been working on cultural sensitivity and embedding this in Primo. Thanks, Stacey. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Brenda. So everything looking okay, sounding okay?
All good from this end. Thank you.
Good, thanks. Okay, thanks for that. So as Brenda said, my name is Stacey van Groll and I'm Discovery and Access Manager at the University of Queensland. And yes, I'll be running you through a body of work that we've done recently, embedding cultural sensitivity into Primo. So this is just a bit of a summary of what I'll be covering today. And we encapsulated this within a project called the Cultural Sensitivity Statements Project. So I'll run you through that. And I've got 3 themes that I'll go through in depth as we go along. Okay. So this project was under the umbrella of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander initiatives projects that were identified a few years ago now, so yeah, back in 2021. And I've already talked about one of them in my Igloo 2021 presentation, Collection Discovery, where we launched Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collections. But the work that we've done starting from August last year into around March this year, it covered several of those projects as well. So kind of bundled a lot of things together that are still ongoing. And that includes collection audits that we've been doing for our special general and thesis collections. It also includes reviewing our cataloguing processes around IATSIS thesauri, for example, and content advice, which is very specific to the project I'll share with you today. And part of that as well as policy and procedures. So making good decisions now, reviewing past decisions, and then writing it all down. And I've gone into a little bit more detail there on the themes down the bottom, which was what we wanted to achieve with the project was firstly to add overall messaging across our library web presence. And we wanted to do that in a few different ways that I'll go into in detail. The second one was that we wanted that overall messaging to link through to new web content that we would be writing in this area. And then the third piece is that we wanted to be able to mark specific records in our library search environment with indicators to advise when specific works had advisory statements added to them. So I always get a bit uncomfortable that it feels like it's all about me, these presentations, but I just wanted to make very clear that I worked with a team of experts around our library, and I've listed them here in alphabetical order. And of course, we also had assistance from additional staff and also our committee that focuses on Primo related items, but this is the core project team. Okay, now this is a high-level summary. Don't worry about how wordy it is because I'll go through each of them in depth. What I'm wanting to achieve on this slide is to tell you that the project staged across several months. And you can see, for example, that I did some of the Primo configuration quite early in the piece in October and November. Part of that was just by necessity because I often go on leave in December, so my annual leave, because it's a quiet time of year for Alma Primo things. And I didn't want the project to wait for me and to be stalled while I was away because there were flow-on dependencies. Projects being what they are, things ended up stalling because our developers had other priorities. And you'll notice that in the customization area, some things didn't go live until February and March. You know, it is what it is when you work on these sorts of projects. And along those lines, I've got in the bottom right there some change logs because, again, projects being what they are, you've got to be really careful of scope creep, but you've also got to be responsive to changes. So I've just noted down some of the things that we changed along the way. And again, I'll go through all of these in turn. So let's go into theme 1, which was the overall messaging. So I've already mentioned our goal that we wanted to add overall messaging to our library environment. And the methods we chose for that was a static text in our search widgets and also an interactive pop-up. And I've just got a screenshot there of our library homepage, and I'll go into each of those 2 pieces now. So the first one was the static text. And we wanted that to be very visible and prominent in our library environment. And we also wanted it to be at the point of likely greatest need going into our library search records where patrons might encounter resources with these advisory statements. So we actually have two search widgets. We've got one on our library homepage, but we've also got one on our help page. And it's often the portal that people come into our environment. If they Google UQ Library, it's quite prominent, that search help page. So we've got a duplicate widget on two of them. So that is inherently limited though, because that's still only two ways into our environment, our overall library environment, and there's lots of different ways in. So we recognise that and wanted to do a bit more. And there were also other aspects of challenge where we changed the project a little because we did originally want a static text element in the footer as well, but UQ mandates that we use a standard header and footer, so that was denied. But we were happy that we still had one static element, so that was fine. And then we also wanted it to be in a separate search box in our original design, a separate box rather. We got kind of a bit of a bento sort of design, but it ended up pushing other important content too far down. So we put it within the search box, and we ended up liking that more because it was very prominent about into our Primo environment for the records, as I've already mentioned, that might have advisory statements. So I'll go on to the interactive pop-up, which covered the use case of many different points into our library environment. But I've noted straight away there that it still is on most library pages. So we couldn't add it to pages where we couldn't inject our reusable custom code. And we also originally added it to some pages and then took it away. That includes pages where our patrons might try and log in and they get an expired account warning because there's really no reason for it to be there. And we also were really aware that some people really hate pop-ups, right? Because they're everywhere across the internet. And we didn't want to undo good messaging with annoyance. So when I was doing some testing, I realized that we have a report a problem button in Primo, and that goes through to a UQ IT form that we can't control, and we can't set a cookie on that. So people are already annoyed if they're hitting that button, so because something's gone wrong that they need to report to us. So we didn't want that to be popping up all the time for them. So another way that we controlled that risk of annoyance was that if they close the pop-up, or if they click the link to acknowledge it or close the pop-up, it stays closed for 365 days. But of course, clearing your cookie will reset that. But there was a compromise there that we wanted it to load open for the prominence factor. Yeah, and then we did have some challenges because when there are small screens, you have to worry about overlaps. So we did the best that we could in this area, and we ended up having to split our custom code for our local chat widget, which is at the bottom right, because this is at the bottom left. Okay, and the clicking the link is the next bit I'll talk about, and I'll go through our web content, which is theme 2, excuse me. Now, this one is a part of the project that I wasn't primarily focused on, so I've only got one slide about this, and other members of our project team worked on this area. So I'll just cover at a high level the methods that we used. So we have our web content on Drupal. So we created a new Drupal page. We added the Drupal page to our collections mega menu, and we also created a dedicated email and that goes into our customer relationship management system in a dedicated queue. So if our patrons choose to visit this page via various means, including from the pop-up, they'll see more information about our advisory statements. So that was one thing that we wanted the pop-up not to be really massive. We have a short snappy statement there, and then patrons can click through to this page for more information. They can also start a conversation with our library staff about flagging a resource to that new email. And they can also see documentation about where we've come on this journey, the guiding documents, as well as if they need wellbeing support materials. And I've noted that there was a change after the project was done. We added a statement about resources that we can't control. Basically, if a patron leaves our environment to go to like PubMed or a database, for example. We can't do anything about that, and it's their responsibility, the source platform, to add their own messaging. So in lieu of adding the advisory statement to every single database record and diluting our message, we added a statement on this page. Okay, so now we'll go into record-specific indicators, which was definitely my area of focus for the project, and so there's a lot more slides for this one. So firstly, I'll do a little bit of scoping about our environment. So we've got Alma, of course, about 2.6 million records. We also harvest UQ eSpace, which is our institutional repository, and we harvest about 35 collections for 58,000 or so records. We also have AtoM, which is an archival management system that we brand as Fry Library manuscripts for our special collections. And we also harvest library guides from SpringShare and CDI as well. So in terms of scoping what this aspect was going to cover for record-specific indicators, you need to be able to get to the records to do this. So that immediately excluded Central Discovery Index. And it also wasn't really in scope because our focus is on collection audits about our own collections. So, and we also excluded library guides because they're collections of resources as opposed to specific works that might undergo a cultural assessment. So that left Alma, UQ eSpace, and Fry Library manuscripts. And another piece of decision making that we did quite early on was our standard terminology, which you can see at the bottom there. So we agreed on a standard statement, but I've noted that we have this a built-in ability for discretionary variations, and I'll show you some of those along the way. But I will, off to the side there, I've noted that we did have some changes. So a bit later in the piece, we realised that we'd used people as opposed to peoples. So we had to do a little bit of work to fix up records for that. So some quick Alma normalization rules. And we also had some legacy practice in UQ eSpace, which had focused on adding advisory statements for several years for theses. So we wanted an overarching statement of resource. And otherwise, we like to use quite consistent terminology. So we agreed on things like advisory statement, cultural advice, culturally sensitive. Okay. Now, I didn't include slides for UQ eSpace and AtoM because of the nature of the ANZREG audience. Probably most likely people are interested in the Alma side of things. But if anyone's interested, I can share them. So, and the ANZREG community might recall back in August 2022, I was put out a call for what do people use as a mark field for this sort of information. And we ended up settling on the 520 first indicator 4, which is content advice, after talking with several of you. And also we want to do the correct mark field. So that's what we settled on. So you can see that I've got the standard field, and I've also noted the discretionary field, which I've noted in variable text to suit the resource. And I've also noted there that we localize the records. So if they're community zone records, then we make them IZ records to avoid any data loss. And I've just got an example down the bottom there. Okay, so now on the Primo side of things and the developer customization side of things, this is obviously a lot. So I've got a summary at the bottom about what happens. So, and it's all pretty obvious stuff. So if the data is displayed in Primo, then it's also searchable, and it adds it to the add data section, which is what gets you the information to your EndNote export, for example. But there was a little bit extra I added in for the facet side of things, and that controls the customization. So if there's data to display a facet, then that also triggers the icon and the banner to appear. And these ones I made very specific. So at the very first level of display, it will only display this field if it explicitly starts with our agreed standard text of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Okay, so I'll go into each of the pieces now in turn. So in terms of the icon, the goal here that we wanted a patron to do a search in I keep saying library search because that's what we call our Primo, so I'll switch back and forth. So if they do a search in Primo, at front and centre, they'll see a cultural advice icon in some of our records and be informed as to whether they want to engage with that record more or not. So I've added some of the challenges that we had here, and it was the most difficult piece, actually. You can see that I've got a screenshot of duplicating icons. We also had instances where it wasn't appearing the brief results, but it would appear after you opened the full record. And it was also doing things like not appearing when you open the overlay, but it was appearing when you entered the full record page by a permalink. So I was really sick of it by the end. When we needed to get it right, and many iterations for this one. And part of that is because the course reading list is a local implementation that does API calls to Atlas Aspire course reading list, so that added some complexity. In terms of the banner, so the goal here is that if a patron then chooses to open the record, that right at the top they'll see record specific information. In this case, the example I've chosen here includes women's business. So we wanted that to be right at the top of the record. And this one we had a little bit of an issue that it was showing up in brief results when we only wanted it in the full record display, but we worked through that one without too much trouble. Now, the reason we wanted a banner as well is if I go to the next slide for the details section, you can kind of see straight away the issue here that the advisory statement is lost in the mix of the other data. And this is one example of, I did this quite early, so I did this back in October, and all the stakeholders that we said, hey, look at this, we're starting to do this work, they were like, this is not enough. It needs to be way more prominent. And I was like, don't worry, the banner is coming. But adding it to the details also means that it's exported in features like export to Excel and email. So it covers it ticks a few boxes. And we did have a challenge here because I've configured our library environment to deduplicate UQ theses between when we have Alma physical versions and eSpace electronic versions, they merge together. So we noticed that if those aren't exactly the same, then we'd get two advisory statements. So that just needs a bit of coordination with our source system staff. Okay, cool. The RIS export, I've already mentioned, it's an out-of-the-box sort of one. So the out-of-the-box rules for Primo will make sure that the 520 A and B maps to the abstract field, which maps to the N2, which is a note field to go to the RIS export. So I just checked and made sure it was there, and it was. Okay, in terms of the facet, so this is a key one if patrons wanted to exclude these records, for example. So if they didn't want to see records with this advisory statement, then they can do that. And conversely, they can include. And then if they do include these records to only narrow to those, then they can lock it in place. They can save it to their favorites. They can share it with their colleagues, which we can also do as well. So it was a key piece of this. One of the challenges that we had is that we originally scoped it to be below our local collection facet, and it was just lost in the mix. So we bumped it up on the day that I said it's live to the core project team. They were like, no, move it up. So we did that straight away. Okay, locations is actually an aspect that is part of our business as usual that came after the project was closed. So what we wanted to do here is when material was identified by cultural assessment as being really highly sensitive, then we've added specific location names starting with culturally sensitive. So, and patrons are advised by that, by the availability statement and in the get it as well. They are requestable. So if a patron puts a request on the material, then our staff are alerted to by that, that name. And also we have physical labeling in the spaces. And if these are requested, then they're mediated, they're not fulfilled until they're run by our reconciliation action plan manager in our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander services and collections team, who is also on the core project team. Basic search, basic. I probably doesn't need much explanation, just that people, if it's in an advisory statement plus also keywords in the text, then people can search for that. But we did do a little bit extra for the advanced search, that I explicitly added the advisory statement as an option to limit the search. Okay. And finally, the pop-up. So I've already covered the pop-up a little bit for the one that's across our web presence. But I just wanted to cover it a little bit for the Primo side of things, and listing all the various search states that we had to test and make sure was looking and working as expected. We had a few challenges, for example, with browse search, which has a weird pagination that's like nowhere else in Primo, and we had to move out the icons a little bit so they didn't overlap. But I left the database search as is because I figured it was, you can still see them and get to them, so I left that alone. The other aspect was that we wanted to make sure if people click on the link in the pop-up that it doesn't open it in the same browser tab, which it does for the rest of our web presence. And that's important because if somebody's like on page 10 or something like that, you don't want them to lose where they are in Primo. Okay, so I'll just cover a little bit about our analytics. I think I'm running pretty good for time. So in terms of, if you do a project like this, you always need to, evidence-based practice, you need to demonstrate that the time and effort you put into it is worthwhile and valuable to seeing how users are engaging. But I just wanted to mention that, the value of this sort of work goes beyond than just the numbers. But in all due diligence, I've included from our project closure documentation some of the ways that I identified that we could measure engagement with this feature. And that includes from Google Analytics, Primo Analytics, library search record counts, and also our CRM data. And I'll just draw your eye, I won't cover all of these, but I'll draw your eye to the bottom three, where you can see that at the time of around the project closure, we had 3 AtoM records, 3,500-ish UQ eSpace records, and 242 Alma records. And I'll just nip over to the next slide with some of I did another snapshot for this presentation. So for the Alma side of things, we've tripled the number of records that now have advisory statements, and we've got 14 records, 14 items that are in those special closed collections. For UQ eSpace, we've added about 200 records. A lot of the records that we already had were the legacy ones that we've had for some time. And I've just noted that we have about 195 that are deduplicated, as I already mentioned. And we've gone from 3 records to 7 for AtoM, which are harvested at a top level. So they cover a lot of content. And then on the Google Analytics side of things, I've just done a bit of a summary of pop-up engagement and also clicks on the search box widget links. So if I start from the right-hand side, clicks on the widget links under our search box, there's been about 340. On the pop-up, which is in Primo and not in Primo, or in both, we've had like 530 or so. We've had 2,300 or so people actually open the pop-up. And then we've got the big numbers of people closing the pop-up, which is not unexpected. As I've already mentioned, pop-ups can be an annoyance point, but also people will see, acknowledge, close, and then go about their business in library search. So this is just a summary of what I've covered today, and I'm happy to take any questions. So I'll just look at the chat.
Yeah, there's a few questions. The first one,
okay.
Can you expand on how you created the guiding documents? For example, were they library created or in hand with your university policies?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by guiding documents, if I use that term. I might, guiding documents on the web content, you might mean. I think that's where I use the word guiding. So that was the piece that I wasn't as involved with, and I don't feel well placed to speak to that directly, but I'm happy to, I can talk to the staff who were involved with that, and I'm happy to put you in touch with them if you'd like.
Great. There's also, were there any Alma Primo tools that you used to help identify the records that you updated with cultural advice?
This was the collection audits that have been done is another aspect that I haven't been too involved with. I've just been on the building side of things. But I believe it started out way back when, simply things like subject heading searches and identifying, and there were also a great deal of work our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Services and Collections team have just recently, a few months ago, they produced an amazing report of all the work they've been doing across all of the different projects that we've been working on. And one of them is sharing the collection audits that they've been doing by the cultural assessment tools that they've created. So they've only, it feels like this is a process that will be ongoing for a very long time. And they've done sort of like the hard yards of refining their process, and it will be more streamlined from now on. But they're still working through all of that. And again, it's one piece where I would say I would defer to those staff rather than answering more myself.
Great. I think that also answers the next question, which was, how did you identify the cultural warning for items?
Yeah, so that's definitely in that piece. Yeah. I actually I had one bit that I took out of my slide, that on the Alma slide, where I had the 520 in our internal documentation, I've got in big bold, only add this by request of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Services and Collections team. So they are 100% responsible for this area, basically. Yeah.
Cool. Hugh says, possibly I missed something, but I'm curious about why it was felt that a general pop-up was needed in addition to the contextual advice on identified items.
That was the part of us wanting to share the importance that we placed on this area by making sure that at the entry point or any point to our environment that we made a visible statement in this area. You can see different ones that other people have used. Like I think Trove, for example, has a large pop-up that takes up the whole screen and forces acknowledgement. So we didn't want to go that far. We felt that the pop-up was sufficient to raise attention and notice that we have messaging in this area. And that's part of the reason why we wanted it to be open as well. So, and the record-specific indicators are record-specific, whereas, it doesn't cover all use cases about our collections and pages.
Great. And Rashmi said, would love to see a future presentation or webinar on using Google Analytics with Primo and Leganto. So I'll leave that open for everybody else to think about next time.
Leganto is definitely someone else because we use Talis Aspire. But Google Analytics is an interesting beast. I love it and hate it at the same time.